2004 was a banner year for video game sequels, with huge games like Halo 2, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Half-Life 2, and Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater hitting store shelves. There was one game that year though that stood out from everything else. It didn't have any guns and violence, it wasn't part of any series, and it certainly lacked any type of massive budget. In fact, it was a project that was made specifically to go against the mainstream trends in the video game industry and relied more on its simplistic ideas and unique characters to stand out. However, its story begins not with a gaming company or a development studio, but with a single person, Keita Takahashi. From an early age, Takahashi had always had an appreciation for creative art, but repetition and conformity were two things he couldn't stand. He enjoyed doing things differently from everyone else and going against the rules and trends set by society. He would pursue art and take many classes over the years, learning how to paint and draw. Takahashi eventually found he wasn't as interested in visual arts and instead preferred working with more physical, tangible materials. When he finally began college, he decided to instead study sculpture. Something bothered him during his studies though. When an artist finished a sculpture, it would serve no practical purpose and often sat in an art exhibit or a park for the duration of its lifetime. Takahashi wanted to break that trend though. He wanted his sculptures to have more practical uses and to imbue them with a more lighthearted vibe that could make its observers laugh and smile. This desire would not only be used in his art, it would become Takahashi's creed and philosophy throughout life. When it came time for him to find a job after graduating college, he surprisingly decided to abandon sculpting and find a job that would allow him to work with a different, more fun and challenging medium. The video game industry, of all things, had intrigued him as a viable artistic endeavor. He hadn't played any contemporary video games, but he had fond memories from his childhood of Famicom RPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest that let the player grow as they progressed through them. Video games would also fit his creed of being a practical tool that could make people laugh and smile. In 1999, he applied to Namco as he had enjoyed many of their earlier arcade titles as a child, but after a few interviews, he was rejected. The company's executives would eventually reconsider after being persuaded by one of his interviewers, who was impressed with Takahashi's courage to speak his mind and his desire to create things differently than the norm. Takahashi completed his formal training and was assigned to a small prototype project, helping to design a unit that acted as both a photo booth and a public email terminal. The project was eventually cancelled, and he was moved to a new project codenamed Action Drive, a game that was very similar to Sega's Crazy Taxi, but saw the driver trying to destroy things around the city instead of picking up passengers. Takahashi and some of the other team members on the project weren't entirely sold on the idea, and a brainstorming session was started to try and craft some new concepts. It was in this session where Katamari Damacy's characters would first be created. Takahashi's game concept was for a character called the Queen of the Cosmos to be kidnapped by some villains on Earth. The King of the Cosmos wanted to go save her, but he was too lazy, so he let his son, the Prince, go help her instead. The Prince was very tiny and much smaller than the humans on Earth. He would need to use his hammer-shaped head to hit the heads of people driving by, and then hack that human by sticking a small steering wheel on top of their head while they were stunned. This was why the characters ended up having such wide heads in their designs. Takahashi's idea was rejected, but he was given permission to use these characters in a different project later on if he so desired. Shortly after all of this, Action Drive was cancelled, and Takahashi had started to become frustrated with his job at Namco, as both his projects had been eliminated before ever really getting started. It was at this point that he was given a choice: join another project already in development, or take a big risk and try and create his own from scratch. He looked through all of the projects at Namco that had openings for artists, but nothing jumped out at him as being very interesting or unique. Takahashi was a bit nervous of the challenges and hurdles that would come along with creating his own project, but this might be his only chance. A chance to create a game that followed his philosophies, one that didn't take itself too seriously and could separate itself from Namco's larger AAA offerings at the time, like Tekken, Ridge Racer, and Time Crisis. Something simpler that could make people laugh and smile. He eventually made the decision to take the plunge and start a new journey creating his own project. A project that would eventually become Katamari Damacy. Takahashi had made his decision, he found he had one big problem. He wasn't quite sure what type of game he wanted to make. He only knew he wanted to create something new and different, something that had never been done before. He looked everywhere for inspiration, hoping something would set his brain into motion. One night, on his way to the train station from his work office, he saw a round object spinning very fast, which inspired him with an idea. By the time he had gotten off the train, his idea had expanded to the spinning ball colliding with various objects and rolling them up. As these objects were rolled up, the spinning ball would grow in size. Takahashi finally had a concept that he could build on, and took the idea to his previous boss at Namco, Mitsutoshi Ozaki. Ozaki thought it was a fascinating mechanic to base a game around, and suggested that he use the characters he had created for Action Drive to help bring his game to life. There was just one big question: would the higher-ups at Namco embrace the idea and give him a chance? Around this time, the company was just beginning a new program called the Namco Digital Hollywood Game Lab. It was a 6-month course that allowed students to learn basic game development and 3D design skills from some of Namco's more experienced employees by creating video game prototypes. This would allow the company to cheaply work on new potential products, while also pulling in fresh talent and easing the training and onboarding process for college graduates interested in working at Namco. Ozaki convinced Takahashi to pitch his concept to be used as a prototype game for the program, and surprisingly, it was selected. Takahashi would work with a team to create this prototype with the possibility of it becoming a full-fledged project later down the road. He would not be working exclusively as an artist this time though, but also as a director and designer. The digital Hollywood students would create the various 3D objects that would be rolled up by the spinning ball the player controlled, while Takahashi tried to wrangle any help he could to handle other aspects of the prototype from various teams at Namco. While Takahashi wanted to develop the prototype for the PlayStation 2 console, Sony's development resources for the console were outdated and tough to work with at the time, so it was decided it would be best to create it instead on Nintendo's more developer-friendly console, the GameCube. He was still very adamant about wanting to use the PlayStation 2's controller for his new game though. Takahashi used his previously created characters from Action Drive to produce a ridiculous story where the King of all Cosmos gets drunk and accidentally destroys all of the stars in the galaxy along with the moon. He then tasks his 5-centimeter tall son, the Prince, to go to Earth and roll up various objects that the king can use to create new stars. The story would also be told through the Hoshino family, who would provide the perspective of people witnessing its events unfold on Earth. The prototype's gameplay stayed very in line with Takahashi's original idea. A spherical object called a Katamari would be rolled around different environments by the prince to pick up various objects that were smaller than it, which made it slowly grow in size. As the Katamari's size increased, it became able to roll up larger and larger objects and gain access to new areas. To keep the gameplay simple and intuitive, the player would use only the controller's 2 analog sticks to move around and control the Katamari. The player could also make it perform a fast dash forward or quickly turn it around 180 degrees. The type of objects rolled up would affect how it would control and move around. The player's main goal was to make the Katamari reach a certain size within the level's time limit by rolling up anything they possibly could. Failing to do so would result in a game over and require the player to try the level once more. As the prototype's development progressed, Takahashi also needed to figure out a title for the game. He would come up with the name Katamari Damacy, often pronounced Katamari Damacy overseas, and never look back. In Japanese, Katamari translates to a clump or mass, which obviously referred to the ball-like object that the prince pushes around the game's stages. And Damacy, transliterated as D-A-M-A-C-Y in English, means a spirit or soul. The kanji characters of the words looked very similar when written out next to each other, which probably helped lead to Takahashi's decision on the name. By the time the team had finished the prototype 8 months later, it had become very apparent that everyone working on it was excited about the project and knew that they were creating a special type of game. Namco certainly took notice as well, and in 2001 quickly greenlit a full version of the game for Takahashi's original console of choice, the PlayStation 2. The one caveat was that he would be required to work with an external development studio called Now Production. Takahashi was concerned his vision for the game might become muddied working with people outside of Namco, but his worries were put to rest when he found out the team at Now Production were very accommodating to the ideas he wanted to implement, as well as his overall stylistic approach for the game. He was given a budget of roughly 100 million yen, or about 900,000 US dollars at the time, and would need to travel back and forth between Now Production in Osaka and Namco's office in Tokyo. Despite many requests from Namco to add more functionality and abilities to the player's Katamari, Takahashi was adamant about keeping the controls and mechanics easy to understand, as he thought there were already plenty of games out there that used many different buttons and had complicated inputs. He didn't necessarily want to make Katamari Damacy an easy game, but he did want its controls and mechanics to be simple enough for anyone to understand. He also wanted a constant sense of player growth throughout his levels, quite possibly an influence from the Famicom RPGs he used to play as a child. Players would often start a level by rolling up small items like a thumbtack and coins, but by the end of the game they'd be rolling up much larger objects like huge buildings and landmasses. The final version of the game would include some additional level goals and extras, like needing to collect certain types of objects in a stage, rolling up just one kind of singular item, finding hidden gifts that the prince could equip and wear, filling up a large collection catalog that kept track of each item that was rolled up, an eternal mode where the player could roll around without any timers to worry about, and a battle mode where two players could compete head-to-head to see who could roll up the largest Katamari within the time limit. This versus mode would incorporate the unique-looking cousins of the prince that could be found and collected throughout the game's various levels. Players could choose to play as any of these different characters exclusively in the game's two-player mode. Katamari Damacy's roster of cousins would continuously grow larger and larger and become a huge staple of the series as it progressed over time. In fact, almost all of these features would be included moving forward in future titles. One of the best-known aspects of Katamari Damacy is its soundtrack. It was overseen by Yu Miyake, who had already established himself at Namco composing music for some of their larger franchises like Tekken and Ridge Racer. Miyake and Takahashi hit it off pretty quickly, as their philosophies on both art and game development were very similar. It was because of this that Takahashi was very trusting and hands-off with Miyake's work creating Katamari Damacy's music. While most video game soundtracks were purely instrumental at the time, Miyake wanted to do things a bit differently with this project and created a score with a heavy focus on tracks with singers and vocals. To ensure the game's soundtrack was unique and filled with lots of variety, he pulled together a group of talented in-house composers at Namco that even included Takahashi's own wife, Asuka Sakai. When it came to finding vocalists, Miyake specifically targeted popular singers and anime voice actors, but not ones that were very active at the time. To keep costs down, he hired artists that, while very talented, were not at the peak of their career within mainstream music. When everything came together at the end, Miyake and his group of composers and vocalists had created one of the most memorable video game soundtracks of all time, one that is still talked about and revered to this very day. In September of 2003, it was finally time to unveil Katamari Damacy to the public, and a demo was shown off at Namco's booth at that year's Tokyo Game Show. It caught the attention of many attendees, especially Sony, who was particularly impressed with the game and pressed Namco to release it a bit earlier than they had planned next year. They incentivized this early release by offering to help fund and produce some of the title's marketing. An agreement was reached, and in the time leading up to its release, Japan was filled with billboards, posters, and TV ads for Katamari Damacy. The game was officially released on March 18, 2004 in Japan and cost around 4,000 yen, which was about 2/3 the price of most titles on the PS2. It sold around 100,000 copies within its first 10 weeks, which weren't mind-blowing numbers, but still pretty respectable for a brand new, unproven IP. Toru Iwatani, the creator of Pac-Man and an executive at Namco, was especially vocal in his support of the game and its fresh, innovative ideas. Originally, Namco had no plans to release the game outside of Japan as they felt it was a bit too much of a financial risk. But after an immensely popular showing at 2004's Game Developers Conference, word of mouth spread quickly and the company decided to change their plans. Katamari Damacy would hit North American shores on September 22, 2004, but would strangely skip any type of European release. Namco had most likely still been a little uneasy about the game finding success outside of its native country, as it released the title with a price tag of just $20, 60% cheaper than most other retail PlayStation 2 games at the time. This budget price, combined with the unanimous praise from critics, made the game incredibly popular, and stores struggled to keep copies of the title on their shelves. People were enamored with its unique gameplay and fell in love with its characters like the small, silent prince and the flamboyant king of all cosmos. In a video game world with many iterative sequels and a lack of original ideas, Katamari Damacy became the poster child in the West for what publishers and developers should be striving for. The title's sales showed people's excitement for what it brought to the table, and while Namco may have wanted the numbers to be a bit higher, it was deemed enough of a success to greenlight a sequel. Katamari Damacy. One of the biggest things Takahashi abhorred was unnecessary repetition of the same idea, and creating a sequel to Katamari Damacy was something he had neither planned on nor wanted to do. Namco, however, assured him that they would move forward on a sequel with or without him. After seeing how much people were enjoying his new game and how many were hopeful for a sequel, he reluctantly decided that he would return once more as director. He wanted this sequel to act as a tribute and thank you response specifically for fans of the original Katamari Damacy, and would appropriately title it We Love Katamari. He and his team once again created this new game for Sony's popular PlayStation 2 console. Takahashi would be given both a larger team and a bigger budget to work with on this project, though he was adamant not to let these affect the theme and spirit of the title, and stressed this to the team throughout development. This new game focused on two separate storylines. The first would be the origins of the fan-favorite king of all cosmos, how he became king, met the queen, and had the prince. The second would be the king reacting to his newfound popularity and fanbase, and the prince fulfilling requests and wishes from various Katamari Damacy fans. Similar to the first game, each request's Katamari would be turned into a star or planet. The game's final stage would then use the Earth as a Katamari to roll up all of the created stars and planets and eventually roll up the sun. While the core gameplay and mechanics remained mostly unchanged from the first title, there were many new objective types, like rolling a sumo wrestler over various food items to make him bigger, collecting objects on your Katamari based on how much money they were worth, rolling up fireflies to make the Katamari bright enough, and creating a Katamari as big as possible using only a limited number of objects. Gifts and cousins appeared once more throughout the stages as collectibles, but this time each cousin could be selected and used in the main single-player game. Constellations and planets from the original Katamari Damacy could also be imported using a memory card's save file. The two-player battle mode would return again from the previous games with new objective types, but this sequel would now additionally include a cooperative mode, where each player controlled a separate analog stick, making the gameplay a lot more social, hectic, and ridiculous with a friend. Yu Miyake would return to oversee and help create another very memorable soundtrack for the game, once more alongside many talented vocalists and Namco composers. While the game included a lot of original new music, it also featured plenty of remixes and arrangements of tracks from Katamari Damacy. We Love Katamari would first be released in July of 2005 in Japan under the title Minna Daisuki Katamari Damacy, translating into English as Everyone Loves Katamari Damacy. It then made its way to North America in September of that same year. In early 2006, the Katamari Damacy series finally made its debut in Europe and Australia. Since these regions had not received the first game, they were actually slightly different from the Japanese and North American versions. The extra constellations and planets that were only available by importing from Katamari Damacy were added as items that could now be collected in the Roll Up the Sun level. Critics and fans both agreed that We Love Katamari improved on the mechanics and ideas of the first game to create a very memorable experience that complemented the original Katamari Damacy. The game also performed well sales-wise, proving to Namco that the series had staying power as a key new franchise that could be developed on a budget. After We Love Katamari arrived at stores, Takahashi was ready to leave the series he had created behind and make something brand new and completely different. He no longer cared what his company did with any sequels moving forward. In 2006, Namco merged with Bandai to form Bandai Namco, and this caused many internal debates and conflicts, which led to the company being less open to new and riskier ideas regardless of how interesting and creative they were. Most likely due to the goodwill built up by the Katamari Damacy games, Takahashi was surprisingly still allowed to move forward and create 2009's unique and experimental Nobi Nobi Boy for the PlayStation 3 and later iOS platforms. But in 2010, he finally made the decision to leave Bandai Namco behind and set out on his own. Shortly after his departure, he and his wife Asuka Sakai would form their own small development studio called Uvula. Over the course of the next decade, Uvula would work in collaboration with other developers on games like Watam and Tenya Wanya Teens. Takahashi also had aspirations to design and build a children's playground, but so far any plans that had been made were sadly cancelled. He has not given up hope on that dream quite yet though. Even with Takahashi walking away from the Katamari Damacy series in 2005, Namco had no plans to end their fresh, new innovative franchise anytime soon, and had already begun work on bringing the prince and his Katamaris over into the portable space. With Keita Takahashi being very vocal about moving away from the series once he finished his work on We Love Katamari, Namco would need to find a new director as they planned to bring the series over to Sony's new handheld console, the PlayStation Portable. Eventually, they settled on Shuhei Kurose, who just like Takahashi, had joined Namco as an artist. This new portable title would be called Me and My Katamari. Its story saw the royal family taking a summer vacation to Earth, but when the King of All Cosmos dove into the ocean, his splash sent a massive wave that destroyed all of the nearby islands. The prince is then tasked with creating new islands for the animals that had been inhabiting them, as well as completing their different requests, similar to completing the fan requests in We Love Katamari. This wouldn't be the only thing similar to Takahashi's PS2 titles though. The gameplay, mechanics, and level goals would not change much in this new title, with most stages simply requiring the player to roll up a large enough Katamari while reusing many ideas from the previous two games. Kurose felt that the series' world had already been established in the first two Katamari titles, and was hesitant to make any big changes as he thought it would be best to stick closely to the first two titles' roots. There were really only two substantial new ideas for Me and My Katamari. The first of which let the player create and name their own island, which was able to be visited by others using the PSP's wireless ad hoc mode. Players on the island could then face off in multiplayer matches against each other. The second would be the game's credits. These added a unique minigame that let the player roll objects up in a 2D 8-bit style version of Katamari Damacy. This 2D gameplay style would reappear again in one of the series' later mobile spin-off titles. Unlike the PlayStation 2, the PSP lacked two analog sticks. Players would need to use either the analog nub or D-pad to act as the left analog stick, and then the four face buttons would mimic the second analog stick. This made the Katamari's controls sometimes feel a bit strange and awkward. Yu Miyake would once more oversee the game's soundtrack, but most of it was made up of music found in the PlayStation 2 games. He would still compose some original tracks specifically for the title though, like Katamari on the Funk. Me and My Katamari released in December of 2005 as Boku no Watashi no Katamari Damacy in Japan, and then made its way to North America and Europe the following year. It received mostly positive reviews, but many critics panned the title's control scheme and its lack of innovation compared to its predecessors on the PS2. The series' next game wouldn't stray too far from Me and My Katamari and would remain on portable devices. Namco would develop and publish Katamari Damacy Mobile for the Mitsubishi P904i mobile phone series. The game used a special type of technology called Gesture Tech iMobile that allowed motion controls on cell phones by utilizing its camera to track movement. Players could move around the in-game Katamari by tilting their phone in various directions, though it also offered more traditional controls as an option instead. While Katamari Damacy Mobile came pre-installed on the Mitsubishi 904i phone models, the title was available for other types of mobile phones as well. The game was incredibly basic and didn't really make any major changes to the Katamari Damacy formula or even offer much in the way of new content. It was released in Japan in June of 2007, but would later launch overseas on iOS, Android, and Windows Phone devices as I Love Katamari over the course of the next few years. Most critics were welcome to have the series on mobile phones, but were not very happy with the game's sluggish performance and controls. While Katamari Damacy Mobile was in development, Namco had already started to work on moving the series into high definition and bringing it over to the next generation of video game consoles. Shortly after Me and My Katamari had released on the PSP, Namco, who was in the middle of finalizing a merger with Bandai to become Bandai Namco, was eager to continue capitalizing on its popular franchise. With Microsoft's Xbox 360 having just been released and the PlayStation 3 and Nintendo Wii looming on the horizon, they decided it was time to move the series to the next wave of gaming consoles. Jun Moriwaki, who had worked as a lead designer on Me and My Katamari, was appointed as the new title's director, and development immediately began to move forward. Initially, Moriwaki and his team planned to make the game for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and in April of 2007, the game was officially announced with the title Beautiful Katamari Damacy in Japan and simply Beautiful Katamari overseas. This title was most likely a nod to the series' transition to high-definition graphics. 2 months later, in June, Bandai Namco surprisingly announced that the PS3 version was being cancelled. While never officially confirmed, it was heavily rumored that the cancellation occurred due to issues porting the game to Sony's notoriously difficult to develop for console. Rumors then began to circulate that development resources would shift over to a Nintendo Wii port of the game. However, in July, Beautiful Katamari was only listed for the Xbox 360 on Bandai Namco's list of E3 show floor titles. This exclusivity was confirmed the following month when the game's cover art was revealed with text on the front that read only on Xbox 360. In September, there was even more confusion when Bandai Namco accidentally listed the title for Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Nintendo Wii on their website before quickly removing it. Moriwaki later confirmed at the Tokyo Game Show that the title was indeed exclusive to the Xbox 360, but that there were plans in the works to bring the series over to the PlayStation 3 with the possibility of a new Wii Katamari Damacy game as well. Beautiful Katamari's story saw the royal family once again on vacation, and during a tennis match, the King of All Cosmos demonstrated his power serve, which accidentally tore open a black hole that sucked in all of the stars and planets in the cosmos, except, of course, the Earth. As had become the norm, the prince was tasked with restoring the missing planets and other celestial bodies by rolling up objects with Katamaris and eventually plugging up the destructive black hole. Similar to its PSP counterpart, the game brought very little to the table in terms of innovation, sticking closely to the tried and true gameplay of its predecessors. The player was generally tasked with making the Katamari big enough or collecting a certain type of item to complete each stage. These levels were often themed around the planet or star you were trying to restore, like Mars requiring you to heat the Katamari to a certain temperature while avoiding colder objects, and Saturn having you collect ring-shaped objects throughout the stage. Even though most of the gameplay remained unchanged, the title did bring a few new modes and concepts to the table. Players could connect with 2 to 4 other people over Xbox Live and play both new competitive and cooperative multiplayer modes online, a big first for the series. It also included online leaderboards as well as a worldwide Katamari that Xbox Live players contributed to and collectively worked together to make bigger and bigger. A photo mode could be activated, allowing players to take in-game pictures of their surroundings. Additional stages were also added as downloadable content and could be purchased through the Xbox Marketplace. Just like Me and My Katamari, the game had a retro-inspired minigame that showed up during its credits. It would play similar to a top-down arcade shooter like Galaga or Xevious, where the player would roll up different objects and could use them to shoot down incoming obstacles. Beautiful Katamari hit store shelves in both North America and Japan in October of 2007, and then released in Europe and Australia in early 2008. Critics and fans alike were very critical of the game when it launched, and it received very mixed reviews. Many felt that the gameplay itself was okay, but that it had dull environments, a severe lack of innovation, and that the game itself felt very uninspired and lacking next to its PlayStation 2 entries. Most people admitted, though, that its colorful and family-friendly themes did stand out next to the countless waves of realistic gritty shooters flooding the video game market that holiday season. It was starting to become clear to fans that Bandai Namco had very little desire to innovate and instead were more interested in recycling the same ideas while attempting to convince its customers to buy a very similar product over and over. The next few years, this became even more apparent as the company began to quickly churn out more and more portable titles. As mobile phones became more prominent and their technology started to vastly improve, many video game publishers found that they could quickly and cheaply develop titles based on their existing IPs. It was an easy way to bring in large profits while avoiding the risks involved with creating larger scale and more expensive console games. Bandai Namco was quick to jump on this opportunity and used many of their existing game franchises to capitalize on the burgeoning mobile game market, and the Katamari Damacy series was no exception. The company had already released Katamari Damacy Mobile a few months before Beautiful Katamari, but they were far from done in the portable space. Katamari Damacy-kun would be a new mobile game developed by Bandai Namco and released just 1 month after Beautiful Katamari. The entire game was based on the 8-bit inspired credits minigame from Me and My Katamari on the PSP. Players would move a Katamari around in a retro 2D environment to roll objects up and make their Katamari as large as possible. The game included both a normal mode and a story mode where players were able to work their way through various stages similar to the mainline Katamari titles while building up their collection catalog. Katamari Damacy-kun was released through iMode, EasyWeb, and Yahoo Keitai services for Japanese mobile phones in November of 2007. 2 years later, in 2009, a sequel was released through the same services titled Oi Katamari Damacy-kun. It featured more stages and items, as well as collectible cousins that could be selected and played as instead of the prince. The following year, another retro-inspired Katamari game would hit phones titled Rolling with Katamari. It was developed by Namco Networks, a mobile phone development division of Bandai Namco that created countless different games, many of which were based on Namco properties. The title featured unique pixel art and isometric stages that mainly followed the same rule sets and gameplay found in the rest of the series. It included over 30 different stages, 5 separate game modes, and even had seasonal-themed content packs like a Christmas theme. Namco released the game on mobile phone services in November of 2008 before shifting their sights to a completely different type of portable device, the Nintendo DS. Up to this point, the Katamari Damacy series had surprisingly never made its way to any Nintendo platform. There had been hints and rumors of a game for the Nintendo Wii, but nothing ever materialized. When Nintendo announced its new digital download service for the Nintendo DSi, appropriately titled DSiWare, Bandai Namco jumped on the opportunity and created Korogashi Pazaru Katamari Damacy, or Rolling Puzzle Katamari Damacy in English. Unlike their other portable Katamari games, this new one was very different and wouldn't be a simple rehash of the franchise's familiar gameplay. It would instead just be a rehash of another Namco game, the Pac-Man series' puzzle game, Pac Attack. Bandai Namco would take the exact same engine and gameplay of Pac Attack and simply reskin it with a Katamari Damacy theme. Similar to puzzle games like Tetris, random objects and block pieces must be placed in a 2D area. The player would then have to utilize a special item represented by the prince and his Katamari that would roll up all the objects that had been placed in a linear path, clearing out parts of the area and increasing the player's score and progress. The game's soundtrack had some new arrangements of music from early Katamari games, but there was one track in particular that was extra unique. Katamari of Love, the ending credits music track from the original Katamari Damacy, would return for this new game, but popular Vocaloid and virtual idol Hatsune Miku would now sing the song's lyrics. Korogashi Pazaru Katamari Damacy released digitally for the Nintendo DSi in March of 2009 and would forever remain exclusive to Japan. Later that year, though, the series would finally make its return to home consoles, and the PlayStation 3 Katamari Damacy game that had been promised earlier would finally reach its completion. beautiful Katamari ditching the PlayStation 3 at the last minute, Bandai Namco had told fans of Sony's new HD console that they still had plans to bring the series over to it. This wouldn't exactly be a brand new game though like Beautiful Katamari, but instead a collection of levels from past games in the series. By this point, the majority of the Katamari Damacy games had all been directed by different people, and this new PS3 title would stick to that trend, with Bandai Namco giving Kenji Nakano the role of director. Its story was split into two different sections. At the start of the game, the King of all Cosmos is hit in the head by a stray shooting star, causing him to lose all of his memories. The prince and his cousins decide to build a robot version of the king to take over his duties, but things go awry and the Robo-King destroys all of the stars in the universe, an event that was becoming a bit too familiar in the series. The prince must split his time between restoring the king's memories and working with the Robo-King to create new stars to refill the cosmos. Almost every stage in the game was pulled in from previous Katamari Damacy titles, making this almost like a greatest hits collection for the series, though there were a small handful of original stages included too. The king's stages were all in black and white due to his memory loss, but as items were rolled up, they would regain their color. Two new features had been added to the game not present in its predecessors. The first was the ability to make the Katamari jump by either flicking the controller up or simply pressing the shoulder buttons. And the second was the King Shock, which could be activated by collecting the King or Robo-King's heart in a level. This vacuumed all of the items within the surrounding area up into the Katamari, either over time or in a single burst. Just like in the previous two mainline titles, a special retro-inspired minigame would be played during the credits, where the prince must continuously bounce off of a cloud and roll up as many objects as possible. The game also had multiple visual styles and filters that could be selected, like cel-shaded and wood grain graphics, though players were able to stick with just the normal graphical style as well. Strangely, the game had none of the online multiplayer capabilities found in Beautiful Katamari, and only supported local versus and cooperative modes. The only online functionality included was leaderboards. Yu Miyake would return again as the musical director and bring in a wide array of musical artists and composers to create the soundtrack and remix many of the series' existing songs. The game was released in Japan in July of 2009 under the title Katamari Damacy Tribute, most likely due to its reliance on existing stages from previous games. When it made its way to regions outside of Japan later that September, it would be given a brand new name, Katamari Forever. It received mostly positive reviews from critics. Many agreed that plenty of care went into creating the title, and that its tried and true gameplay still was pretty fun. But the lack of much brand new content and innovation kept it from being anything truly special. While it was a small step in the right direction, it was far from what fans of the series really wanted, and Bandai Namco continued to show their reliance on old, recycled ideas and content. The Katamari Damacy franchise's next outing, however, was quite different. It would be exclusive to South Korea and place the series in a very unlikely genre. In 2007, Windysoft, a South Korean developer known for their free-to-play MMO titles, announced a collaboration with Bandai Namco to create an MMO based on the Katamari Damacy series. This title would be called Guehon Online, Kuyera Wangjanim, or simply Katamari Damacy Online. Roll it, Prince. It was directed by Gan Zhongying, who spent 2 years developing the game. Throughout development, he and his team butted heads regularly with Bandai Namco, who was very protective over their Katamari Damacy IP. They worked through their disagreements though, and in 2009, the game was nearing completion. It entered closed beta tests in late 2009 before finally being made available to the general public in February of 2010. Due to the game being on PCs, it could be played using either a controller or a keyboard. Katamari Damacy Online featured both single-player and multiplayer maps, with each sharing the same 3 game modes. These modes all utilize the same types of goals found in previous titles in the series, like making the Katamari a certain size or rolling up specific items. Being an MMO, however, there was definitely a much larger emphasis on the social and multiplayer aspects than in other titles in the series. The multiplayer mode allowed for teams of 3 to face off against each other in the game's various maps. Zhang In originally wanted the mode to feature 4 vs 4 matches, but the load times were too heavy, so the number of players was reduced. Many of the maps were reused from previous levels in the series, though there were some new ones like a map based on Seoul, the capital of South Korea. The game also introduced over 30 brand new cousins that would remain exclusive to it and never appear in any other titles in the franchise. Similar to other MMOs, Katamari Damacy Online featured player emotes and a large hub where people could interact with each other. Within this hub, players could also purchase different cousins and cosmetics to customize both their character and Katamari. Additional cousins and cosmetic items were made available through a string of various game updates and patches. The title also made some small adjustments to the series' mechanics, like adding a meter that needed to be filled to perform a quick dash, and having certain Mario Kart-like items available that players could pick up and use either on themselves or against their opponents. While Katamari Damacy Online was probably the most the series had innovated on its ideas and gameplay in a long time, the game sadly never left South Korea and eventually was completely shut down in early 2012. Unfortunately, in other regions, this innovation would not continue, and Bandai Namco would focus its efforts on pumping out more Katamari games on portable devices over the next decade. By 2011, the Katamari Damacy series was no stranger to mobile phones, and Bandai Namco would continue to put title after title out on mobile platforms as the years moved on. Katamari Amore would be announced at E3 in June of 2011 and hit iOS devices just 3 months later that September. It featured the standard Katamari Damacy gameplay of rolling up objects to meet a certain goal and included many of the normal game modes like Story and Eternal Mode. The Katamari could be controlled by either tilting the device utilizing its accelerometer or simply by using 1 or 2 virtual analog sticks that would appear on screen. The game featured some unique Namco crossover stages though within its purchasable level packs. One themed around Pac-Man where the prince must roll him around through the classic arcade mazes collecting power pellets and dodging ghosts, one themed around Galaga where incoming enemy ships must be rolled up to progress, and one themed around Tekken, where you must train Kuma, a bear from the popular fighting game series. These new modes weren't incredibly groundbreaking from a gameplay perspective, but it was still interesting to see the crossovers implemented nonetheless. The game itself was free to download, but included only one level that had a 2-minute timer on it. All additional levels, like the Namco-themed crossover stages, were locked behind purchasable level packs. In 2012, Katamari Damacy Mobile 2 saw release on iOS devices in Japan, but it is unclear whether this title was a direct port or just heavily based on Katamari Amore, as they both shared the exact same stages and level packs. Critics, as usual, panned the game for its lack of innovation and were also critical of the title's camera, level design, and lack of initial free content. 2 months later, in December of 2011, Sony's second foray into the portable console space, the PlayStation Vita, hit store shelves in Japan, and with it came a brand new Katamari Damacy game. Once again, this title would have a completely different director than the others, and saw Bandai Namco designer Fumihiro Suzuki take the helm. Its story sees a young boy asking his mother and father which is more awesome, the king of all cosmos or his school principal. The mother replies that they are both equally awesome. The king overhears this conversation and begins to reflect on his recent complacency and the disappointment it brought to his fans. Interestingly, the game's story seemed very self-aware and acted almost as a commentary to the series' recent history, taking a similar approach to 2005's We Love Katamari. While most of the dialogue was the king speaking about himself, he does so in a way that much of it could be interpreted as how the Katamari Damacy games had become somewhat lazy and phoned in, and that its fans had become tired and disappointed in the series. The game itself was spent rolling up Katamaris based on the requests and advice from people for the king. These Katamaris are then eaten by him to help get his cosmic belly into shape and regain his former glory and popularity. Sadly, even with the game's not-so-subtle commentary on the state of the series, it did very little to innovate on it and rehashed many of the same ideas and gameplay found in previous titles. It did add one interesting new mechanic though, the ability to use the Vita's front or rear touchscreens to alter the Katamari's shape. It could be squashed down, making it easier to roll up more objects, or squeezed vertically to more easily navigate through tighter spaces. While not incredibly groundbreaking, it was an interesting new idea and contained at least some innovation for a series that often saw very little of it. Players could also pick up cousins like in previous games, as well as cosmetic items for both the prince and the king. Free downloadable levels were added as well, like the Pac-Man stage from Katamari Amore and the Snowman stage from We Love Katamari, that could be unlocked using the title's in-game currency. Series music director Yu Miyake would not oversee this game's soundtrack surprisingly, but would still compose and contribute music for it. Instead, Taku Inoue would take over and fill Miyake's shoes surprisingly well, putting together an impressive and catchy collection of music and songs for the title. The game released in Japan of December 17, 2011 alongside the PlayStation Vita under the title Katamari Damacy Nobita, a play on words between Nobi, the Japanese word for stretch, and obviously Vita. Outside of Japan, it would also launch with the Vita on February 22, 2012 under the title Touch My Katamari. The series continued its steady review score decline, with critics being vocal over the unchanged game mechanics and level designs, especially after this many years. Most agreed that the new ability to alter the Katamari's shape was interesting and fun, but not quite enough to turn things around with its repetitive, all-too-familiar gameplay. While not the final game in the series, this title is the last original mainline game in the franchise to be released, at least at this point in time in 2021. After Touch My Katamari and 2012's Katamari Damacy Mobile 2, the series went a few years without any new game releases. This would generally be normal for most video game franchises, but the Katamari Damacy series had received a new game almost every single year for nearly a decade by this point. It's unclear if Bandai Namco wanted to simply give the series a break, or if sales for its more recent titles had been poor enough to halt the constant stream of Katamari releases. Either way, the series was given a short rest. Once 2016 rolled around, Katamari Damacy would once more make its grandiose return as a mobile clicker game. It would be called Tap My Katamari and released for iOS and Android devices. The title was incredibly simplistic to play, requiring the player only to tap the screen continuously to make the prince roll his Katamari forward and slowly increase its size. Objects that were rolled up gave coins to the player, which could then be used to purchase upgrades and items for the prince to help cover additional ground with each tap. Cousins could also be purchased with coins and other in-game currency to keep the player's Katamari moving forward even when they weren't playing the game. Every 10 stages, the player needed to complete a time attack challenge before being allowed to proceed to the next level. Tap My Katamari would not have a very long life cycle, as support for the game and its servers were discontinued just a little over a year after its release. While some fans welcomed the game with open arms, many were not happy that this was the first Katamari title after a lull in the series. Not too long after Tap My Katamari had been launched though, Bandai Namco filed a trademark for a new game called Amazing Katamari Damacy, which once more gave fans hope that a brand new title more in line with the mainline games would be announced. That hope would be very misplaced. When Amazing Katamari Damacy was finally released the following year in late 2017, many fans were shocked to see it was simply an endless runner game for iOS and Android devices. Similar to other endless runners like Temple Run and Subway Surfers, the prince and his Katamari would constantly remain moving forward on their own during gameplay. The player must dodge obstacles by jumping or moving to the left or right using either touch controls or the device's accelerometer. The prince would begin the game rolling his Katamari on a tabletop, but as time went on and the Katamari grew in size, the stages would slowly change to different locations like a house, a small town, a city, and eventually even outer space. If too many obstacles were hit, the game would end and the player would restart from the beginning. Cousins could be rolled up throughout stages and granted the player different power-ups like a temporary score multiplier or the ability to destroy obstacles. The cousins and their power-ups could even be upgraded outside of gameplay using in-game currency to improve their abilities' effects. Many of the characters' designs were altered slightly to make them look much closer to Keita Takahashi's original artwork. Even though it was merely a smaller spin-off title, Amazing Katamari Damacy is the most recent original Katamari game to be released, at least right now in 2021. However, it is not the most recent title in the series, as Bandai Namco would develop one more entry after Amazing Katamari Damacy. Many fans had been clamoring for an HD remastered version of the first two Katamari Damacy games, and in 2018, they got at least half of their wish. 2009's Katamari Forever had brought with it a collection of stages from each of the first few titles, but this new game would be a full-on remaster of the very first game in the series, Katamari Damacy. While the main differences between this remastered version and the original were the graphical enhancements and added widescreen support, it did make a few additional changes. Most of these changes brought the North American version more in line with the original Japanese release, like the Hoshino family now retaining their original Japanese voice acting. There were also other minor adjustments, like the time limits increasing in certain stages, item locations being changed, and character designs being tweaked to look more like Takahashi's original artwork designs, just like Amazing Katamari Damacy. The prince was now much more expressive during gameplay as well, and would react more to what was happening around him with various facial expressions. This remaster would be titled Katamari Damacy Encore in Japan, and Katamari Damacy Reroll everywhere else. It was released in December of 2018 on both PC and the Nintendo Switch before being ported over to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in late 2020. Whether Bandai Namco has plans to create another brand new mainline title, make more mobile spin-off games, or simply just remaster We Love Katamari is anyone's guess. But for now, Katamari Damacy Reroll is the newest game in the long-running series, bringing everything around full circle, with Keita Takahashi's original creation ironically being at both the start and finish of the series' release timeline. The Prince, the King of all Cosmos, the Cousins, and all of the franchise's other characters weren't relegated only to their own titles, however, or even just video games in general. The characters made appearances both outside of their own series and even outside of the digital world of gaming. Katamari Damacy has built up quite a legacy over the years in its own games, but like most popular franchises, its characters also made cameo appearances in other video game series. Some of these include Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Kerodo RPG, also known as Sergeant Frog RPG, the Tales of series, Crossy Road, Fast and the Furious, the Tekken series, Famista Dream Match, Keita Takahashi's own Nobi Nobi Boy and Watam, the Idolmaster series, Little Big Planet, Sword Art Online Fatal Bullet, and many, many more. The series also saw plenty of official merchandise like t-shirts, vinyl records, plushies, pins, keychains, and art prints. Katamari Damacy was even showcased in some of the exhibits in New York City's The Museum of Modern Art. Even though the Katamari series might not have had the most consistent track record over the years, the fact that it's still relevant and adored so much even today proved that Takahashi's vision and the foundation of its gameplay, themes, and visual style were strong enough to carry the franchise on their back for almost 2 whole decades. And it all came from one person's desire to create something different, something that turned its back on what the norm had become in the video game industry. Even after the series stumbled regularly and fell victim to the very habits it had been created to break, many people around the world can all still agree on one thing. We love Katamari.
Okay, Mr. Sunshine.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a very weird one to make. The front half of the video is very, very narrative heavy because obviously going into Keita Takahashi's backstory and him convincing Namco to let him make this game and just kind of his his frustration with the gaming industry and all that stuff. But then the second half is pretty much just Bandai Namco slinging out Katamari games as fast as they can, which is, I guess, kind of part of the story as well, so that's why I included it. But it was a really strange one to actually make, honestly. I'm sure I'm also getting a lot of weird looks about my pronunciation of Katamari, which I usually just say Katamari in everyday talk, but the internet is very judgmental, so I was trying to say it in the correct Japanese way throughout the video. But however you want to say it, really doesn't matter. It's tomato, tomato, honestly, in my opinion. Honestly, after playing the amount of Katamari Damacy games I did for this video, I am insanely burnt out on the series. I am tired of it. I don't really want to see a Katamari Damacy game for many, many more years. But if I had to pick a favorite, I would say We Love Katamari is definitely top tier for me. And I would love to see a re-roll or HD remastered version of that if Bandai Namco ever wants to put it out, which they probably will, honestly. And also, I'd like to thank L.E. Hall, who put this amazing Katamari Damacy book together by Boss Fight Books. It's a great read. I highly recommend checking it out, and it really was very helpful for putting this video together. So thank you, L.E. Hall, and definitely check out the book. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please tell me your favorite Katamari Damacy game, or how it's had an effect on your life. I'd love to hear about it. And I should have a new video to you guys, hopefully in the not so distant future. So thank you again, and I'll see you soon. Bye.